Well, this is the fourth time that I'm talking here to the so-called Botin Scholars. And I think that it's quite important to understand that I think that what you are supposed to be interested in is in what kind of public policies, what about public service, what about the issues about the governance in our own societies. And the big question would be why this should be of some interest from the point of view of young people, young professional people. I understand that it's not easy to become what you have been selected for. And therefore, why is that the younger generation is so devoted to the question of public service? And why public service is supposed to be important? And that depends in what are you thinking about. Why? Because I think that there are two major approaches to the question of public services, or to the question of public policies, or to the question of, at the very end, what kind of society we would like to be speaking about. At the very end, till what extent the societies where we are living can be shaped according to the wishes of the people living in those societies. And I think that the divided line between two major differences of thinking, those that think that societies are shaped according to the desire and wishes of everybody, and probably everybody will agree with that. The question is that some people used to think that wishes of society are expressed through market forces. And other people used to think that the society is too important an issue to believe only to market forces and not to the citizens' will. Let me explain. Those that think that market forces is what is really important, then that people will think that it's up to the consumers to make the definition. And all of us are consumers. Therefore, if all of us, given our individual preferences, are the ones that are going to make the difference, then it's going to be rather easy to understand what's going on in that society. The only problem with that definition is that it's true, all of us are consumers. The only problem is that as consumers, we are not equal, because the size of our pocket to consume is different. Therefore, if you accept that consumers, through the aggregation of the individual preference of everybody, will shape society, that society at the end is going to have the equities or inequities of the market economy. And the differences in size of our pocket at the end will shape the difference in the society where those preferences are supposed to shape. You see what I mean? The other alternative is to say, look, the shape of a society, the character of a society is such an important issue that I think that better we try to make the decision being made by the citizens. Now, of course, if you decided to make a definition by the citizens, then the big issue is, how are you going to listen what the citizens are talking about. What are the wishes of those citizens? And therefore, the only way to express is to have a democratic system. Otherwise, how are you going to listen what the citizens would like to have? And therefore, the divided line are between those that think that the consumers are going to shape or the citizens are going to shape. And the only difference between those two kind of people, because it's the same people, that people as consumer has a different size of income and pocket, but as citizens, all of us are exactly equal. And therefore, if you wanted to think that the shape of society is going to be according to the citizen wishes, then I think this is extremely important definition. After saying that, this does not mean that the market is not important. The market is extremely important. And all of us know that we are living in a market economy, and all of us know that because we are living in a market economy, in order to have a good functioning of the market, well, some kind of regulation will be needed. But that is part of the public sphere. Who is going to establish the regulation in order to have a good market economy working? And the second point that I think is important with regard to this definition is that then citizens will like to have a democracy that delivers, a democracy that works, a democracy that is able to listen what the citizens are talking about. And in order to deliver, then the big issue is what kind of public policies are you going to implement? Because if you want, as a citizen, to be listened, and you have different alternatives from politics and different candidates, and by definition, democracy has to be representative. You elect those that are going to represent your ideas or your views as a citizen. And therefore, to say that citizens will make a definition, democracy is becoming such an important issue in order to be able to listen to those citizens. So, here is when some thinkers like Norberto Bobbio from Italy used to say that in any particular society, citizens will say that all of us are at least equal in something. All of us has to be equal in something, at least. The first time that human beings decided to live together, the first thing that those people living together decided was to have security. And security means that if we are going to be living through farming, I want to make sure that all of us together here, farming in the land, we are not going to be invaded by somebody else. So the first thing that we would like to be equal in something is to self-defense. It's very obvious in today's world. To have countries, and countries has boundaries, and nobody is going to invade another country. But it's very obvious. But it's so obvious that we don't keep thinking how happy we are because somebody defends us. No? That's normal. Or the way that you administrate justice in your own societies. That's very obvious. But what when somebody in a country thinks that education should be available for everybody, like the history of education in Latin America? And what about if you say, look, I think that everybody needs at least know how to read and write. So I think that 4 years of education is enough. And if you see the history of Latin American countries, and I would like to question you, when was the first time in your country that you had compulsory education? And at the beginning, compulsory education was for how many years of education? Not for 6 or for 12, just for 4 years or 3 years. In my country, in Chile, compulsory education was a discussion of about 20 years. And in 1920, the decision was to have compulsory education for 4 years. That was enough. But then you say 6 years. Then you say 8 years. And finally you say 12 years. But that was a decision taken by the citizens, by either the president, the Congress, or whatever, or a combination of both. But when that you say that, that does not mean necessarily that education has to be public, because you can have private education. And private education is perfect. What's the problem with that? As long as everybody has guaranteed that there is a chair and a desk to go to school. So, if this is the case then, and as Obvio say, all of us has to be equal in something, well, citizens at some particular time decided that all of us has to be educated. Or later on, somebody will say, look, all of us has to have access to health. Because it's only for the market. No, I think that everybody is entitled to, when he is sick, that somebody will take care. But then you have a discussion in this country, what about the healthcare system, Obamacare, and all the discussion today, you know? And somebody will tell you, no, I don't think why this has to be a question of the public sphere. This is a private thing, but this is a discussion. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that when you say that something has to be available for everybody, what you are trying to define is what is a public good or services. And somebody can say, look, a democracy is a way to define what kind of public services are available for everybody. And needless to say that a public good or service is a dynamic concept, because will change as long as the society is changing. If you are living in a richer society, higher per capita income or whatever, then what kind of public goods? And therefore, the big issue is there's nothing like a public goods in the neoliberal thinking, because that is a definition made by consumers. But there is a definition of public goods when you are living in a society where you think that it's up to a democratic system to define. I would like to be living in a society, as somebody would like to put it, where there is no fear that you become ill because you are covered. There is no fear that you are going to be uneducated because there are some kind of education available for everybody. Or there is no fear to be unemployed because you have some kind of employment insurance. Or there is no fear of what's going to happen when I'm old because there is some kind of pension system. Anyhow, so much for that. But the question is that this is a question that has to do with the kind of where you are interested. And why is that I think that is so important what through Santander and Botin Scholars is important is because they are thinking that it's necessary to have at least some part of a society well trained in order to be professional for public service. It's wonderful to have people in private service. And this is tremendously important to be an entrepreneurship, how much of innovation are you going to introduce, etc., but how much of innovation in the public or in the private sphere, etc. After saying this, I will say yes. The only problem is that the mood in a particular society is also going to be shaped by the international events. And the amount of people that will tell you that it's important from the point of view of the society to be shaped by consumers and not by citizens, well, till what extent the international economic crisis that started in 2008 is moving the pendulum from one side to another. And people will be talking about what about regulation, what about the financial system, in order to have a right way of thinking about. And therefore, I do think that before and after the crisis, you have a different thinking. Because at the very end, when you say, but with regard to the crisis, my goodness, what Mrs. Merkel is doing, what Obama is doing, what Cameron is doing. Oh, you are thinking in politicians. You are not thinking that bankers are going to solve the issue. So you are thinking in public policies. Because what Mrs. Merkel is going to do? A public policy. In that direction or the other, but it's a public policy. So, better you be prepared for the next crisis. Because in your lifetime, I'm sure that you will have a crisis. And better you learn from previous crises. And some people used to say that in Latin America you have in the past so many crises that you learn so much about that for the first time Latin Americans are innocent of this crisis. We used to be guilty of every crisis everywhere in the world. And remember the time of the tequila crisis? Yeah? Or the devaluation in Brazil about, 99, 98 with President Cardoso? Or the daiquiri crisis there? So many. In other words, what I'm trying to tell you is that because of the crisis, the question of public policy are becoming more and more important. And therefore, the big issue that I would like to address this afternoon with you is that the kind of public policies that we used to think that work has been changing so fast because Latin America has been changing so fast. So the first part is what kind of thinking with regard to public policies? Is it a consumer thing or is it a citizen decision? The second is what happened with Latin American lessons given what is the new Latin America society that we have. Because you are going to be working in quite a different society. Why? Because now for the first time, you have democracy in all over Latin America, with one or two exceptions. But that's a question of discussion, okay? But the fact is that all our governments has been elected. And in some occasions, some government has been replaced before the constitutional period because citizens decided to protest walking and going to square. Okay. But in that cases, has been replaced according to what the Constitution is talking about. Okay? The only problem is that democracy is changing, and we will see later. Number two, during all this period, the paradigm from the economic point of view has been that it is essential to have economic growth in order to have better standard of living. Or if you prefer, it is essential to have economic growth in order to have better social and economic indicators with regard to our people. So as long as you're able to have growth, then life expectancy will increase, then infant mortality rate will decrease, then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, what public policy are you going to follow? Those that are able to produce growth. Because it's true. If you have a $5,000 per capita income and you make a perfect distribution of income, you will have a perfect distribution of poverty. By definition, with 5,000, what can you do? Now, if you have 15, well, you're in a much better position. And needless to say, is you are closing to 20,000. And the point is that in today Latin America, in the case of Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, Costa Rica, and some others, all these countries are very close now to $20,000, $25,000 PPP, purchasing power per capita income. And therefore, all these countries are going to be facing a different paradigm, where it's not a correlation between per capita income that is increasing and social and economic indicators are improving. Because after the $20,000 per capita income, what really makes sense with regard to social and economic indicators is not increases in income, improve social and economic indicators, but how that income is distributed. How that income is distributed. And this makes a tremendous change. Because you have this country, $40,000 or $45,000 per capita income, and social and economic indicators are not as good as social and economic indicators of New Zealand, with something like 30,000. And what really explains the difference is distribution of income, not to say anything about the Scandinavian countries or Japan. So, the biggest demand, and all of us know that from the point of view of distribution of income is very uneven in the region. In spite of the fact, third change, from the social point of view, Latin America during the last, 10 to 12 years, has been improving vis-a-vis those people living under the poverty line. What happened in Brazil? What happened in Mexico? What's happened in Colombia? What happened in Chile? All those countries. And from the point of view of Latin America, as a whole, people living under the poverty line was about 44% 2003. 44, 2003. Now, less than 33. So 10 points in 10 years of reduction of people living under poverty. The big issue is, in Chile, we used to have, this is a commercial, you know. In Chile, we used to have 40 or 45, and now there's a discussion between 11, 12, or 15. But the question is, you know, that if you have 40 or 45, and then you have 15, well, that 25% that used to be living under the poverty line, and is not living anymore there, they have the feeling that they alone were responsible for that. And therefore, that was his or her achievement. And now, they have a sense still of vulnerability because they can go back and be poor again and live under the poverty again. And they don't like it, of course. But at the same time, they are demanding more than the time when they used to be poor. And the first thing that they will demand normally is education for their children. They wanted to have access either to higher education, because they never finished higher education. Many of them never finished primary education. But also they would like to have for the children to go to higher education, to university or to postgraduate training after high school. And all of us know that it's quite different to have a public policy address to solve the issue of poverty than to solve the issue of higher education. The demands of those two different things are so obvious. In short, what do we have now is a different stage of development, I could say. A different stage of development with regard to democracy. Why? Because now we have democracy. But democracy, by definition, has to be representative. You elect somebody to represent you. He is the president. He is your representative in Congress. The other one is your representative at the city level. But by definition, democracy is representation. It's not possible to go back to democracy like the one that we were taught in school when we were in high school or in primary, in Athens. In Athens, 2 centuries ago, excuse me, two millenniums ago, when they told us that the citizens from Athens used to meet every Sunday to discuss policy issues. But during those happy days, no more than 150 males, of course, not females. Females are supposed to remain in the house, you know. Well, males were making the definition. So it was a direct democracy. There was no representation. But in today's world, you need to have representation. And the big issue is that in today's world, when you have democracy because a number of people knew what are the major questions that has to be solved in that society. In the past, you have the king, members around the court of the king, and they solve the issues. And when was changed? Why was changed? Because Gutenberg discovered the press. Now, of course, the idea of having a press was to be able to produce books, and particularly the Bible. Because without Gutenberg, you will not have the reform in the 15th century, 16th century of Luther. But when that you have a press, 200 years later, somebody discovered that it was possible to print a journal, a newspaper. But it took 200 years from Gutenberg discovering the press to have a newspaper. But once that you have a newspaper, according to the New York Times, all the news that fit to be printed, well, once that you have the press, all of us know here in this room what's going on in the public sphere. All of us know what the king will have to decide tomorrow. But since all of us know what the king will decide tomorrow, why don't ask the king to consult us? And this was the thinking of some French philosopher. In short, democracy is the byproduct of the press and the fact that everybody will know what are the public issues. But during those days, democracy was reserved for males that knew how to read and write. It took another 100 years, more than that, much more than 200, to have the radio. And if you are unable to read and write, you can listen. And you can make a definition of your own because you listen to what's going on in the radio. Or 45 or 50 years later, then you have TV. But during all this period, either because of the paper, because of the radio, because of TV, democracy was representative. And there was no participation from the people, other than writing a letter to the newspaper. That means that somebody, the leader, was supposed to give beautiful ideas about the future, and you will have to make a decision which of those different leadership are going to be those that suit to what you think is better for the country. But now, because of the new technologies, because of Twitter or Facebook or whatever, or internet, all of us knows about everybody. The system that I emit an opinion, you will listen and will vote, is over. And I have been in many conferences like this. Probably this is also your experience, that is going through streaming. Everybody is looking to that. And you, as soon as you end a beautiful sentence, then you will be a tweet character saying, and who are you telling us those stupid things? Period. Now you know who you are. In other words, is it the first time? And the big question will be, and this is a question for you, not for me, what kind of political institution will emerge in the future that will shape a different political institutions? In order not to have the people going to the square demanding, I want to participate. We, the people, elect you, but we, the people, will like, with regard to this issue, to recover my decision to make a definition, because I don't trust you. I'm not sure that you know exactly what I think. Is it possible to think that because I don't like a law being approved by Congress, that so many citizens can ask for a decision to call to a plebiscite to abrogate that law? Can you think of that in the future? Who knows? In some institutions already exist that. In some countries of our Latin America already exist that. If it is possible because I elect you for president for 6 years, my goodness, 6 years is such a long time, that after 3 years I can ask for revoking the powers that I give you, well, but you can put that in the Constitution. In some Latin American constitutions, you know that that exists. The problem is that the way you are going to run a country is quite different if you know that after the 3rd year, people can say, I want you to go home. So the way that I'm going to rule the country is going to be different if you have that political institution or not. So it's not free to have that beautiful ideas, because the way that you are going to run the country is going, it's like in this country. If you are not being able to be re-elected after 4 years, this means that it's a failure. Is that a good idea? Depends, matter of discussion. In short, this is a big challenge from the point of view of South America and Latin American countries. How are we going to solve this issue of participation? Not only for us, but of everybody, or any country that has a democracy. Number 2, how are we going to be able, from the economic point of view, to address the issue of distribution? Let me tell you, it's so easy to discuss about distribution here in Watson Institute. It's so difficult to discuss about distribution in the real world. Because you have, big changes in distribution before and after taxes. All of you know about the Gini index, right? Of equality, inequality, etc. What's the gene in Latin America? 0.54. When 1, it's absolute inequality, and when 0 is absolute equality. 0.54. And what about Europe, the OECD countries, the richer countries of the world? 0.48. Not so bad, 54 or 48, okay. But the big but is that after taxes, what about Latin America? 0.54 is 0.53. What about OECD countries? 0.48 became what? Have an idea?
20?
Huh?
20?
Little bit more, 29. You see the tremendous difference before and after taxes. Something had to be done. And be careful with the average. What about the difference in regions in the same country? Infant mortality rate in Chile is 8 per 1,000. Bravo. Very good. The only problem that in some richer, wealthy neighborhood, like a council of one of the councils in Santiago, the 8 per 1,000 is only 2 per 1,000. But in some other cities, small cities, far in the south in Chile, is 43. How about that? 2 and 43. You see the difference? The gradient. 2 and 43. In Puerto Saavedra. Okay. Oh, that was about 8 years ago. Probably has changed a little. But what I'm trying to tell you is that it's not only the big numbers about distribution of income, it's also about distribution among different regions in a particular country. So it may be that you have wonderful numbers at the aggregate level, but not so beautiful numbers given the distribution inside the country. It would be much better to have 4 and 16, and still you have, from the statistical point of view, the average of 8. Because from 4 to the gradient, is going to be not as big as 43. So the issue of distribution is becoming an extremely important issue in Latin America today. And what about the demands from the social point of view? And then, where we were questions about the demands of this emerging middle class. And the emerging middle class is something that will keep coming and coming and coming in Latin America, and that's going to be the new landscape that you have to address. And the final point would be, what about governance? What about the public institutions that we will have in Latin America to be able to face these different tasks? And these different tasks will have to do with the question of education. And you can have a tremendous discussion about public versus private education, which is fair. But all this discussion now will take place within an international economy, because no single society is living as an autarky, with no relation with the rest of the world. And let us be clear, globalization is here to stay. Globalization is a fact of today's world and will be bigger and bigger in the future. And the big issue is, are we going to have some rules of the game with regard to a globalized world? As a well-known historian used to say, Eric Osborne, in today's world, there is a mechanism that every day this planet is more and more global, interdependent. The only problem is that we have not been able to advance in some sort of a global governance. And therefore, different countries will try to adapt. So then you have in Latin America the Alianza del Pacífico, the Pacific Alliance, or you have the Trans-Pacific Alliance, which is Trans-Pacific, the countries of Latin America, plus United States and Canada, and on the other hand, the countries on the other side of the ocean, like the Asian countries. Or you have today's discussion between the United States and the European Union about the huge trade agreement between the United States and Europe. That is not only trade, but also the rules of investment. And needless to say that between the United States and the European Union, you have such a large group of countries that probably more than 50% of total trade will take place in that alliance. And needless to say that given the failure of the World Trade Organization, probably that alliance, Atlantic Alliance, will put the rules of the game. And something to think about. Why do you have the Trans-Pacific Alliance, and you have United States, you have Mexico, you have Colombia, you have the Central American countries, you have Peru, Ecuador maybe, Chile. And why would you are talking about the Atlantic Alliance, the U.S. forgot about Mexico? And as far as I know, Mexico has coasts in the Pacific and in the Atlantic. Am I wrong? No. And what about Colombia? Buenaventura? Huh? And the only problem, in today's world is that globalization has changed geography. My goodness, this is different of what I learned when I was in school. The other day I was in Cartagena de Indias. And they decided that I had to go to see what's going on in the port of Cartagena de Indias. I was not very happy because there are so many things to see in Cartagena de Indias other than going to a port, but I had to go to a port. And when I was there, I discovered that they told me suddenly, do you know, sir, you used to be president of Chile? Yes, sir. I said, well, sir, this is the most important port in the Pacific. Oh, you're kidding. You are in the Caribbean Ocean, no? You are not in the Pacific. Yes, sir. But given the number of ships that are coming or that are going from Cartagena to the Pacific Ocean, we are the major port. Probably my face transmit that I was not sure of that. So they say, came here with us. And we went to a large room, like this one, and here you have a huge map of Latin America facing the Pacific. And here you have all the boats, all the ships at that particular moment. You see, these are all the ships. One of those ships are going south, others are going north, but all the ships. And you want to know what are the ships coming to Cartagena. Boop. The majority of those ships, in terms of ship with containers, were going to Cartagena, to my surprise. And they have to know that because then they will know at what time and what day those ships are going to be docking in Cartagena, and then where are they going to be located in order to right away take all the containers out and put the new containers in. And then the ship will go right away So in today's world, geography depends. Or if you prefer, what is the sense of saying I'm the I'm the Pacific Alliance? Well, because we look to the Pacific. Well, because the Pacific is going to be the most important ocean, so I will have a tremendous advantage. Bravo. But be careful. In those so-called post-Panama Canal ships, those ships that cannot go through the canal, now you have the post-post. The post-post are those that cannot go through the enlarged Panama Canal. But those ships are so huge that if you put one container behind the other, the number of containers are so huge that those containers, if you put one behind the other, will have a line of 100 kilometers. You listen well, 100 kilometers? You can put 100 kilometers of container, one after the other, in just one ship. And that ship, going from Santos or Buenos Aires to Shanghai, vis-a-vis those going from Valparaiso or Callao or Buenaventura in Colombia or Veracruz to Shanghai, will take just more additional days. So the advantage of those that are looking at the Pacific is just one day. And needless to say that what is really expensive is not one day moving that ship. What is really expensive is how I'm going to put the containers in that ship. Therefore, I could say that Santos has a good or a better way than Cartagena de Indias, then Santos will defeat those countries that ports are facing the Pacific, period. So what it used to be a tremendous advantage in the past, not anymore. Given the new technology, given the new ships, given the... This is why I think that the question of this, I don't like really the way that here you have the Pacific countries and here you have the Atlantic countries. Because that reminds me what happened 500 years ago. 500 years ago, did you know about the Treaty of Tordesillas? What is Tordesillas? Other than being a small little town in Spain, of course. But what is Tordesillas? Come on, you have to know what is Tordesillas.
The decision that was made so that Spain or Portugal, mainly both of them, could divide America so that they had the territories and not get into war for that.
That's exactly the point. Colon discovered this part of the world, and therefore the question was, who is going to own what? And the discussion was between the major powers of that day, the major maritime powers of that day, Spain and Portugal. And there was a treaty between the Catholic king and queen Isabel y Don Fernando in Spain, and I think that was Don Jaime or something like that from Portugal. They make the Treaty of Tordesillas in the very important city of Tordesillas. I assume that was very important at that time because today it's not as important as they used to be. And during those happy days, of course, one that you have a treaty, in order that the treaty is going to be the agreement of everybody, the Pope has to ratify that. And the Pope ratified that in 1506, period. And that's the reason why here you have Brazil, and why the reason here you have the other countries. And the question is that in the way that we're going to live, I would say, is Latin America going to be talking at the international level with one voice to be listened, or is going to be speaking through so many different voices like the voices that we have now? So if everybody would like to speak, nobody will listen what we try to say. In short, a big challenge in other public policies and public services is also there is anything that we can do at the international level. In short, what I'm trying to tell you is that there is a lot of challenges at this moment from the point of view of public policies. Because on the one hand, what is going to be the role for the consumers and what is going to be the role for the citizens? That's the first big definition. And number two, given that definition, what are the areas of influence of those particular sectors? How are you going to be able to be dealing in terms of public services? That means that many areas that you think belong to the domain of the public sector, how are you going to incorporate the private sector to those things? It's one thing to say, look, I'm going to have a building, operate, and transfer with regard to building a highway with private money, but it's a different thing to say that I want that the highway will go from here to here, and the speed of that highway has to be so and so and so, and that belongs to the public domain. So the fact that you decided that something has to be at the public domain doesn't mean necessarily that cannot be carried out by the private sector. So I would say it's a tremendous challenge, the one that you will have from the point of view of public service. What are the areas of those domains? How are you going to be able to keep the private sector moving? Till what extent the private sector has a very important role to be played? Until what extent you are able to have a space for the public regulation of the private sector in order that the private sector perform much better. And this is a big issue of discussion, of course, but I do think then that here is another challenge that we have. What about the governance that we have in our own countries? Until what extent this is a major area of discussion. And I think then that you are going to be dealing with this new Latin America that is much more sure of what's going on. After all, because we are innocent of this crisis, or probably because we used to have in the past so many crises, our financial system has had a very good resilience given the new situations in the world. And we have had no financial crisis in spite of the financial crisis in the United States and in Europe. And therefore, we feel a little bit more confident. But at the same time, we have to know that to a big extent, we are going to be facing now another and different challenges. And from the point of view of public services, what are going to be the right public policies? We were able to know the public policies in the past. And because those public policies in general succeed, then you have to change the agenda. Then you have to change the public policies. Because you succeed in the past, you have a different society, and you have a different society with emerging middle class, where distribution is going to be very important, where more participation is going to be demanded by the people, then you will have to change your public policy. But that is going to be your problem and not my problem. And the big issue is then that you have to learn from the past. But you cannot apply the tools and the lessons of the past for the present where you are going to be living, because it's a different region, fortunately, for the better, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, President Lagos. I think we have until 4:15, is that correct? On the schedule, so just about 15 minutes for questions. So Let's see, please, questions for President Lagos. Yeah, over here.
President Lagos, thank you very much for such an interesting lecture. I'd like to ask you something. I mean, taking into consideration that you say that democracy nowadays really comes down to representation, I think that the major problem of representation is the lack of communication from the governmental official to the people that is being represented. So I would like to know, in your perspective, as being somehow an expert in public service, which role is playing nowadays social media when it comes to communication between public officers, public servants, and the population of a country?
Well, I think that your question goes to the heart of public service, in a sense that I think that the most important job for a president is to communicate. I mean, he's the major communicator in the country. He's the one that can explain the policy that he's trying to accomplish. And particularly, he has to be the major person that will explain to the people why this policy is not working. Because when the policy is working, it's very easy. But when we have problems, then who is going to explain that? And I'm not saying that you need to run a country looking to what is the latest poll, approving or not approving what is your job as a president or as a member in parliament, as a prime minister. But the big issue is, how are you going to be able to think in the long run interest? And this has a very close connection with the big issue is, which is very difficult. Normally, every politician is looking to the next election. And the problem is that normally you need to have a long-term view of where you would like to go. And that means, what about the next generation? Not about the next election. And that is much more difficult. Because sometimes you have to take measures that are against the will of the majority. Because after all, you are the leader. You are supposed to lead. You are supposed to explain why you are leading in that direction. Let me give you an example. In Chile, it's very important copper. And copper price is an essential part. But when you have sunny days and copper price is going up, everybody has a brilliant idea of how to spend that money coming from copper. Are you going to spend all that money that is coming through that brilliant ideas, or are you going to save for those rainy days? When sunny is over and now it's raining. Oh. And you have to communicate them. Look, we are going to save something because tomorrow, etc., etc. But how are you going to do that? So how the media is going to cooperate. And I understand that the media also has their own political views against or in favor of a particular government. The only thing that I will ask to the media is that to make it very clear, to present the facts, and when they want to interpret the facts, they explain that that is a news analysis and not factual analysis. See the difference? And number two, I know that the relationship between the media and those in public offices is a difficult one. Because normally those in public offices are so confident of how well they are trying to do that normally it's not a good news, a news that is going to be listened by everybody. And therefore the question is, how are you going to be dealing with those two things? You see what I mean? I think that I'm doing wonderful, but I receive every day criticism from the press. That's normal that everybody thinks that, you know. Why is that the people don't put that I built so many houses for those that need more housing? Because it's no news. But if the houses are going down because there was an earthquake, that's going to be a news. Because you built bad houses. Now, this is a tension. Because that tension is part of a democratic system. So if that is the case, then the question is how are you going to be able, because that tension exists, to be able to present the news that fit to be printed. Yeah.
There was a question here. Are you going to be able to say it? Get some help.
I will try. Thank you for the presentation. My question is related with democracy. You touch many themes. Inequality, democracy too, is related to the question from Mauricio too. It's about the relation between the social movements and the political parties. We have many different experiences in our countries, like experience in Brazil with the Partido de los Trabajadores, or our experience in Chile. We have a really separated relation between the political parties and the social movements. But now in America, have born many social movements. And what is your opinion about the relation between the political parties and the social movement, like an expression of democracy? Because now our countries are, for example, Colombia too, have a stronger social movement claiming for some changes. And I think that is a form to express the feeling of the population. I want to know your opinion, because you have too much experience in politics and public service.
Well, I think that one of the questions that you have today is that in the past, political party used to provide a whole picture of the society, has answer for everything. But suddenly, it so happened that when you have a green movement, environment, climate change, you discover that not necessarily a political party has an answer. And because political parties were unable to have an answer, then you have the green parties all over, or the humanist party, or whatever you want to call that. In other words, till what extent there are some issues that political parties are unable to answer? Or till what extent there are some areas where participation is becoming so strong? Try to build an airport, like folks in Mexico. He couldn't. He couldn't. I mean, people didn't want to have an airport close to your house. Not to, where are you going to put the waste disposal? Eh? Where are you going to be a new prison? Not in my backyard. In my neighbor's backyard, that's okay, but not mine, please. Not in my city council, not in my, you see? So there's a lot of questions that people will say, look, you have to listen to me. And then the question is, how are you going to deal with that? And that has nothing to do with political parties. I was Minister of Public Works, of Infrastructure. I tried to build a highway under the city of Santiago. And of course, those people living close to the highway, they didn't want the highway. Because what's going to happen with the neighborhood, the quiet neighborhood with so many? So finally we decided to build the highway under the river. Huh? Because the movement was Costanera Norte no. Period. And then how do you manage those two things, you know? And that, I think, is a very difficult issue from the point of view of political parties. Because they used to have answer for everything. But now, many areas are not. And then the question is, what is the kind of expression of those social movements? And this question then the legitimacy of a democratic system. Because if political party don't express the demands of that social movement, and that no social movement are not represented in parliament, so who are those representatives in parliament? And this is why then you have questions like the demonstration of students in Chile, or in Brazil with Dilma Rousseff about the very recent protest or whoever. And I think that this is something that will continue because people feel more empowered.
Thank you, Mr. Lagos. You were talking about the democracy and the right of representation of citizens. But what do you think about the Chinese economy? A country without a pure democracy, but with amazing economic results. What can Latin America learn about Chinese case in order to gain better economic results? It's only about the political system, or is the democracy the main problem of Latin America?
Well, it's so difficult to compare, 20-something republics with just one, and given the size of that country, 1.3 billion. And the total population in Latin America is only 500. Number two, I would say that in the case of China, the very large growth first is a statistical problem because you start for a very low yardstick. So when you are 100, when you have a growth of 10, it's 10%. But when you have 1,000, if you have a growth of 10, it's 1%. So you see, that's one thing. Number two, the big advantage of that country was the low wages. And therefore, the question is that now, because low wages are increasing, well, many people will tell you, like our Mexican friends here, that now many of those things that went down to China from Mexico now are going back to Mexico because salaries are going up. So it's not only a question of the political system, it's a question of the number of people, and it's a question of low wages. And number three, it's true what you say, in a sense that the political systems are different. But this reminds me when Jiang Zemin came to the United States, he told me that, and was very surprised that whenever he went, there was people outside saying Jiang Zemin is a dictator. And Jiang Zemin told me, these people didn't know that I have to deal with so many problems, The Politburo that says something, the Central Committee that says the other says, well, it was very difficult. To run a country like China is very difficult. And then I went to Harvard, and they told me that people are so smart, they say they will know that I'm not a dictator. And it was worse, because the following day in Harvard, the students were claiming that thing. So the following day, he met with Bill Clinton and said, I was thinking about that, and I think that I have the solution for this. I have so many people that I think that if I can send 10% of the Chinese people to migrate to the United States, I can solve my problems. Would you accept that, President Clinton? Oh, not at all, said Clinton. No. So you don't believe in the movement of free people? Well, yes, I believe, but 10% of the Chinese, 130 million, that's too much. Oh, so are you also a dictator? In a sense, you don't believe in, you see the point? What I'm trying to say, look, it's very difficult to, when you see that they are building a dam, and through the dam, they have to make movement of at least 5 million people, because 5 million people are living now in lands that are going to be inundated with the dam. My goodness. So the question of the political system is a big issue. Now the big problem is, are you going to be able, if you keep growing, to keep that system? And I think that from that point of view, your question is quite pertinent, you know. In addition that they have quite a number of people that low wages and everything. But now that low wages is decreasing, is the difference, I mean, the difference is what's going to happen in the future? Are they going to have a growth of only, quote unquote, only, say 6 or 7% instead of 10? But still, those 6 or 7 compared with the West is extremely high. So I think that there's also a question that are two different civilizations. They have a sense of time quite different from us. We used to think that a century is a long, long, long time. They used to think in terms of millennium. And it's so different to think in millennium than to think in. The old answer that you and I say, what do you think about the French Revolution, sir? Oh, I think that it's too early to say something.
On the issue of time, we are past our time for this session. I know there are a bunch of questions up here. I see 3 or 4 or 5 hands, and we're not going to be able to take them now, but you're going to have time to interact with President Lagos later in the week. He'll be at the screening on Thursday night and also at the conference on social media. So please join me in thanking Ricardo Lagos for wonderful and lively lecture and discussion with you. Thank you.
Well, good to see you then.